Welcome to the Ingles farm. This is the home of Mary Draper Ingles after her return from Indian captivity. Kind of interesting about this farm that this farm, since William and Mary Draper Ingles, is 8 generations of descendants have lived on this farm. In 2002, my family put this farm on a conservation easement to protect it, and it was permanently zoned historic preservation and agriculture. Currently, right now, it is a working farm, and my father actually uses it in modern farming, kind of carrying on a long tradition that I'll get in about William Ingles. Just want to give a little background that what we do down here in this reconstruction is not based on family lore. What we have here is based on historical documentation. We've kind of found that it's a little bit different than had been passed down, and we wanted to show more of probably what it was like at that time. It is still a very interesting story, though, even looking at the original documents. I'll start first by the land. The land that we're standing on today was originally given as a land grant to Marquis Calmes and was surveyed in 1747. The boundary of the farm was not far from where we're standing here, and it went all the way into present-day city of Radford, where the post office is, so 1.4 miles from the spot where we're standing here today. It was listed as 400 acres, and we've soon realized that the survey was pretty bad. When we went back to the chain survey and we looked at how it was done, we knew there were some problems with it. However, on the original land grant, it was for 400 acres. We don't know when William acquired this land. His son John said it was several years after Mary's return. We know by 1762 William and Mary are living on here because of a license given to William in November of 1762 to operate a ferry from his land. He acquired many other lands. And in fact, at his death, he had nearly about 6,000 acres. However, none of it was contiguous except for one other piece to where we're standing today. His other piece that was surveyed in 1768 was on the other side of the New River, and it was 55 acres. Now, with this land, probably one of the most important things that William did was agriculture. We know he had a ferry, and we knew the ferry was important, but agriculture played a pretty important role in his life. On William's last tax assessment that was done in 1782, he was listed as having 67 head of cattle and 51 horses. Interesting enough, throughout his time before this last tax assessment, he was noted many times as selling cattle to the Army, such as the Cherokee campaign of 1776. Interesting enough, we kind of find his amount of horses that he had kind of perplexing. It was the most that we found of any person had in the county. We don't know if it's because the Great Wagon Road came through the farm, so we don't know if he was the used car salesman of the 18th century. However, he did have a large number. Some of them were probably used in his farm operation, and some sold to people moving westward. He was also listed as in his will as having hogs and sheep. He never listed how many he had, but looking at plantations of his size in Montgomery County at the time of his death, they were probably in the numbers of each of about 25 to 50. The next thing I want to talk about is the importance of the farm militarily. And I'll have to say, militarily, nothing ever happened here, so as far as battles. But what was interesting is this was a place that was pretty vulnerable on the frontier, particularly after Mary's return in 1755. Between then and 1763, there were multiple attacks by the Shawnee in this area. We know that he had a fort at his house. Again, I'll reference his son that wrote that he had a fort at his house, and we know the name of the fort was Fort Hope. We don't know where it is. We don't know which of the buildings that we found down here could have been the fort, or if we've even found it. All that we know, it was at his house. Also, during the Revolutionary War, people served in the Army and later would have pension requests. In some of their pension requests, they mentioned prior to the Revolution being stationed at Captain William Ingles' fort on New River. One of them in particular said he was stationed there for 18 months. From there, he said they went out and went as what they referred to as Indian spies, or looking for evidence that the Shawnee were coming through the area and to be able to alert neighboring settlements. William's military career was he mainly served in the militia during the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. He was a major under Andrew Lewis at Point Pleasant, and after Point Pleasant became a colonel of the Montgomery County Militia until he resigned his commission due to failing health shortly before his death. One last thing I'll mention militarily was George Rogers Clark took Vincennes in 1779 and captured the small garrison there. When he did, they captured the Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton and sent him back to Williamsburg to stand trial. When they did that, this entourage of 51 people, including guards and prisoners, recorded their time coming through the area and made an interesting note in his diary. And I'll read it to you. As they were moving from the west going east to Williamsburg. And this was May 8, 1779. In the evening, we crossed over a ferry, the New River, or Great Kanawha, and were kindly and hospitably received at the house of Colonel Ingles. Here we rested for an entire day. The scenery about his house was romantic to a degree, the river very beautiful, the hills well wooded, and the low grounds well improved and well stocked. I particularly enjoy that because as somebody trying to recreate possibly what it would have looked like here, it was very interesting to have that in his diary. As we look around today, the lowlands are cleared and we actually have stocked with cattle, but the surrounding hills are wooded. So I like to think of what we see today was probably not unlike what it would have looked like in 1779 when Henry Hamilton came through. Next thing I'll go is talk about is his household. Behind me you see the recreation of one of the structures that we found on this site. We know by his will there were multiple houses in his household. We have actually found multiple buildings on this site and have only reconstructed the one that had an archaeological dig done in the 1970s. By 1856, we know there was only, by a drawing done, we know there was only one structure left. In 1773, William was licensed to operate an ordinary out of his house. I have found the original license, and I know that according to the license and by the law, it was good for 1 year. We never found him have another license after 1773, so we're unsure if he operated an ordinary after that point. Ordinaries were typically run out of somebody's house. An ordinary, we like to call them taverns today, but an ordinary was, to use a modern idea, was more like a bed and breakfast. They were usually not structures in the frontier built for a specific purpose of being a tavern. They would be a place along a road that somebody would be able to come and find lodging and a meal and drink. The rates were set by the county and were regulated to what could be charged. Again, we're not sure how long he operated an ordinary, but all we have evidence for is the 1 year. If archaeological digs can be performed in the future of the other buildings that we found on this site, we would like to reconstruct everything to how it would have looked in the 18th century. The reconstruction we have here is based on what we think it would have looked like. We had to pick a time frame. This farm's been in operation for over 200 years. So we could have picked any time frame, but we were most interested in the Fincastle County years, from 1773 until 1777 when Montgomery County was formed. One of the reasons we were interested in doing this was because we had the best records of this farm, and it's a very interesting time. We have peacetime, we have war with the Shawnee, and then we have war with the mother country, England. The cabin we reconstructed here, we reconstructed in 2003, and this cabin was reconstructed based on the archaeological dig done in the 1970s, but also a photograph that was taken in the late 19th century before this structure fell. Inside of it, it's furnished to how we think it would have looked like, and that was based on not only what we found archaeologically here, but also what we found in local inventories. What kind of pieces did they have? What pottery did we find here? What did we not see? How much of certain items all played into how we furnished the insides of it. I'll also go into what we've done here as far as the living history. We kind of wanted to make this a small living history site to be able to talk to people, not just about William and Mary Draper Ingles, but we wanted to talk to people what was life like in the 18th century here in the New River Valley. William and Mary's life was not unique. Many people shared the same life that they did. So by reconstructing this here, we like to tell the story of all the people here. One of the ways we did that is by the sights and the sounds. In order to do that, we've started acquiring livestock here, historic livestock that represents what they would have had back then. You'll see out into the field milking Devon cattle, and those cattle came from Colonial Williamsburg and Mount Vernon's breeding program. That's a critically endangered breed that there's only about 600 in the world right now. And not only does it help show the story of what it would have looked like, but it also helps preserve this endangered breed. Interesting to note, the breed is what they refer to as a triple purpose breed. That's something we don't have much of anymore. They were good for oxen, they were good for dairy, and they were good as beef. In modern times, we've specialized and we have dairy breeds and beef breeds. But in this era, we didn't have specialized breeds, and they needed animals that could do all three. The other thing I'll mention is the sheep. And the sheep to my left here are Hog Island sheep. This is another critically endangered breed of livestock, and there's only about 200 registered in the world today. They came from Hog Island, Virginia, and were isolated on this island with very little influence from other sheep throughout the time. It was an inhabited island, but the sheep remained feral, and every year the sheep would be rounded up and the sheep would be shorn, and crops and slits and marks in their ears would designate whose sheep was whose. So for the other 364 days out of the year, the sheep would remain feral. What was interesting is though we know they came from what appears to be a English breed, they represent what the sheep would have looked like 200 years ago, because they remain pretty much unchanged. One of the things a lot of people notice when they look at them, everybody thinks they're goats because of the horns, but the horns were something that we've over time bred out of sheep. The sheep here came from Mount Vernon's breeding program, and since we've started to breed them here on this site. If you come to any of the events that we have here, you'll probably see some things, the life of these animals, including in June, spectators were able to see one of the milking Devons give birth to her calf. So depending on when you come, you never know what's going to happen. We use interpreters too to demonstrate life. We try to do things to show different aspects of their life. In a couple weeks, we will actually have one on lighting, and we'll be talking about how they made candles, but not only candles, but other forms of lighting we don't think about, as grease lamps, rush lamps, and splint lamps. Other things throughout the year that we do here also is harvesting crops. We grow flax on site and process it for the public. That's one thing that the public usually knows very little about when they come here. We've all heard of linen, but very few know where it came from. One of the other things that we had to do in the reconstruction of this also was that we had to do a lot of research on what things would have looked like. One thing I'll mention are the fences. We originally started splitting all these fences here on site. And our construction of our fences, if you notice, some of the fences are pretty short and some of them are quite large. Well, the small fences ended up not keeping out livestock, so we actually had to go back to the original records and find out how were fences really constructed. So if you notice the tall fence over there that's pretty large, that was actually based on an article of agreement between two farmers in Montgomery County in 1779. They specified how the fence was to be built, how many rails high and how tall. And what you see there is based on their article of agreement between William Poynter and James McGavick. Interesting enough, at this time period, it was a fence-out culture, and what you see over there, the large fence, is what they would have referred to as a lawful fence. Didn't mean that you would be thrown in jail for not having a fence that was at a minimum of 5 feet tall. But a strong, well-built fence, a minimum of 5 feet tall, was considered lawful because everybody had to fence other people's livestock out of their own crops. So in order to sue for damages, what was called trespass, you had to end up having a lawful fence. So far, we found out that the fence is actually kept in the animals, unlike the original fences we built. When you go around and talk to the different interpreters, please go inside the cabin. Britt is in there, and not only can she talk about the cabin, but more importantly, she talks about the story of William and Mary Draper Ingles. Mary Draper Ingles' story is a fascinating story, and there's many questions we have. Unfortunately, there's very little documentation on the story. The best documentation was written by her son in the 19th century, and he wrote down a letter that chronicled her story. Though we do have to understand that there are some things in the story that people question today, meaning, did Mary have a child? Because John doesn't mention it. There could be some things that John didn't want to talk about, or his mother didn't want to talk about, and therefore it was not included in the story. But it's the only story of Mary Draper Ingles that was told by somebody that actually talked to her. And that was the most important thing about his document.